Tuolla Lontoossa Jennin mä kohtasin. Halo Vepi, oho. Hän on neidosten joukossa kaunihin. Halo Vepi, oho.
Well, welcome again to an episode of Gloucester Bookies that is special because it's something I've wanted to do for quite some time. And we're gifted with the presence of George Rosen, Professor Rosen and author George Rosen, who has a chance now to I've invited him on to answer questions in an interview form. George, say hello.
Hello.
George and I have been exchanging jokes and witticisms back and forth, and we'll see how far that goes on the air. But we'll at least start off. I want to bring people up to date on to put it in context. George is not born and raised in Gloucester. George, where are you from?
I'm from.
It'll catch you.
They'll catch me. I'm from Blanco, Illinois. Well, actually, I'm from the Chicago area. I was born and raised in the city of Chicago, raised until the age of 6, and then I moved to a suburb of Chicago about 10 miles, 10 or 12 miles north of the city limits, in an area which is called the North Shore of Chicago. And coming here eventually, decades later, I got into trouble when talking about that I was from the North Shore because, well, it's the North Shore, but you know, there's an ocean, there's Lake Michigan. They all have shores, and they're and also none of them. It's interesting. It's true of the North Shore too, of Massachusetts North Shore, is that one would think that a North Shore is if you had like a round lake.
Yeah.
The North Shore is going to be on the northern part of that lake, or so that, say, Greenland theoretically could be part of the North Shore of the Atlantic Ocean. Because if you go north, you run into the land, and it's the North Shore. Whereas in both Massachusetts and Illinois, what they really mean is they're both the North Shore is and the South Shore and the South Shore of Boston are really both parts of the western shore of the Atlantic.
Right.
And so there's a northern part of the western shore, or north of Boston. There's a South Shore part of, but they're really not the North Shore, and neither, given the fact that I lived on the western shore of a Great Lake, which is a great lake. It's a very big, long, deep lake. It really shouldn't be called the North Shore. So
you can tell.
I apologize.
You can tell how you became a professor.
I've only been temporarily a professor. It's many years. I was a lecturer, strictly speaking.
Tell us this, if you're a believer in this, as I am. There are two types of professors, two types of people, really: lumpers and splitters. The lumpers kind of oversimplify and mash everything together into one big ball or two or three large entities. And splitters are happy to do the routine of inventories that end up, 15 or 1,000 little pieces and fragments. The Civil War would be described differently by a lumper and by a splitter. And would you say then you were a splitter?
Yeah, I don't know. I was no, actually. I mean, what I mostly did when I was a lecturer in English was try and teach people to write. And,
impossible.
And it's very hard. There's also a distinction which a certain, I would assume you call him a lumper, once made. Isaiah Berlin, who is a famous historian of the 20th century, kind of, and he wrote about statesmen, and he made a distinction between foxes and hedgehogs.
Yes, I remember that.
That's the thing. So that's
the fox knows many things, and the hedgehog knows one thing.
Basically, yeah, that's right. The pusher ahead and the hopper about her. Anyway.
it's one of those things. You mentioned Isaiah Berlin. We're just conversing. Isaiah Berlin. My favorite story about Isaiah Berlin. Somebody really wanted to meet. Isaiah Berlin. I wish I would meet him. Can you possibly? And then he was indeed brought in to meet his fan, his supposed fan, and the fan was constantly talking with Isaiah Berlin, the historian, about Broadway and hits and musicals and everything to do with over there. And it turned out that
he thought he was Irving Berlin.
He thought he was Irving Berlin.
Yes. It just took me until now to catch what was going on there.
I don't know if it's worth it. But it isn't. Anyway, we have a chance to illuminate something that's a wonderful story. I've heard it from George, and I'd like to share it. I'd like him to share it with you. His late wife, that many of you know, remember very fondly, top of our class in class of '66, and a great person in her own right, Barbara Gale. How did you meet? You and Barbara meet.
How did I meet? Well, we actually had encountered each other at Harvard, where she was a student at Radcliffe and I was a student at Harvard, and very, very briefly, we only recognized this encounter a couple of years afterwards, that I had acted in a silly Shakespearean production where I played two dukes in As You Like It, the Shakespeare's comedy, and there's human comedy. There's a good duke and a bad duke who are brothers.
And you were both.
And I was both. Yes, this was the brilliant casting idea. It's been done a number of times, but it's one of those things that kids who want to be directors say, "Oh wow, wouldn't it be cool if the good duke and the bad duke were really the same person?" And there I don't know enough about Shakespeare to know if this was true in the original production, but since they never appear together on stage, it might have been what happened in the original productions too. So when it does happen now, one of the things you have to pay attention to is how they dress. So you got to distinguish them since they're the same person.
Which meant costumes.
And Barbara Gale, in addition to all her academic achievements, was a very talented seamstress. And she had, for instance, worked at a bridal shop in Somerville when she was in college, to make some money because she could do really great alterations and all these kind of things. So that's how we encountered each other. But 4 or 5 years later, after we both had been married and divorced to other people, we met each other at a party held by kind of a group of common friends. Friends we had in common. And we had a long and wonderful discussion, and I had mentioned the fact...
Context is beautiful. It's part of the story. It's a party for...
people who have birthdays in May.
That's right.
Yes.
If you had a birthday in May, it didn't matter what date, all the May birthdays were meeting for this party.
Yeah.
And
there was a number of people. We have
mutual friends.
We have mutual friends and including me. This was out of I don't know how big is a group of mutual friends, from college. It's like 30 or something, and it was really even smaller. 4 of them, including me, had birthdays in May.
There he is. He was a guest of honor, host of the town, and Barbara and he talked.
So we talked, and we both kind of thought to ourselves separately we should get in touch again. And I had mentioned
These are two independent minds thinking alike.
And I had mentioned that I was a writer, or was hoping to be a writer. I'd already been half of a writer, and that Barbara then was being an editor at the Atlantic Monthly, as it was then, which the predecessor of what everyone now calls including themselves, just the Atlantic. And so while I was thinking of trying to realize whether or not I'd like ask for her phone number or something, which I'm not sure I had, she actually wrote me a letter on Atlantic Monthly stationery and asking,
Which you still have.
which I still have. Yeah, I kept, and asking, why don't we have lunch or dinner? And I'd like to see your stories.
There it is.
And that was nice. And signed it Barbie, which she wasn't quite still using. I mean, if this is reaching people who knew her from Gloucester, she very definitely was called Barbie, until the age of 20, but she started getting touchy about it, as did her sister Judith, who used to be a Judy. So.
Oh, isn't it true? Us guys and
Waynes and Georges, there's nothing.
There's nothing, but those people like that, which do develop these nicknames, or if it would be called a nickname, I don't know, a different.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, it depends. It's a diminutive nickname.
Like that.
Because I had the only person I ever let call me Georgie was the band director, the music guy in the elementary school that I went to, and I also kept taking lessons from him into high school, and I worshipped him. He was just great. Taught me clarinet, saxophone, and things like that, and he would call me Georgie, and I respected him so much that I let him call me Georgie, even though no one else did.
Yes, well, I mean, I've been, every time I talk with George, I learn something new. But I knew that you kind of played around with banjo.
No, guitars and ukuleles. Yeah.
Ukulele. But I didn't know the clarinet.
I was basically, growing up, I was a wind player.
Yes.
I played first played clarinet, then
yeah. I mean, for
saxophone,
years.
And flute, and even I and our sons appeared in David Benjamin's. What do they call them? The Cape Ann Summer Community Band. The Cape Ann Community Band.
Yes.
And I on occasion, I played in a local dance band for like two dances where they were looking for a baritone saxophonist, and the guy who runs it, I can't even remember the guy's name, but he needed a baritone saxophone. And he saw me playing in the Cape Ann Community Band. I was playing a baritone saxophone, which I don't own one. I play tenor, or used to play tenor, where I developed some bad arthritis in one hand. Tenor saxophone. But I was playing a borrowed from Gloucester High School, baritone saxophone. So he said, "Oh, gee, you must be a baritone saxophonist." So I played.
Off and running. I tell you. Musician, lecturer, writer, and dare I say, as soon as we touch the subject, it goes wild, I'm sure. Political enthusiast. I mean, you probably can't grow up on the North Shore of Chicago in Mayor Daley's day without becoming somewhat politically wired or activated.
Yeah, and also I had parents who were ardent left-wingers, far to the left of most everybody at that time, and they were people they had,
which was easy.
Which was easy, yeah, and so the circle of people I grew up, circle of parental friends who I grew up in, were all people who'd been connected in one way or another with the Progressive Party of 1948, which nominated Henry Wallace, who was Franklin Roosevelt's last vice president.
Right.
And so in the very strange 1948 election, there was Republican, there was Harry Truman, who was the president and a Democrat, and there was Thomas Dewey, who was a Republican. But the Democrat Party had split off actually into kind of three factions, the bulk of it being the main Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats, who were Southern Democrats who were upset about the idea of integration and integrating, like the army and these things. They'd split off, and they were under the leadership of Strom Thurmond, who eventually, who ran as the presidential candidate of this Dixiecrat party. It kind of, I don't know if they actually officially called themselves Dixiecrats, but everybody did, and they accepted the name. And he eventually went over and became a Republican years later, and was a staunch, awful, in my mind, awful Republican senator from South Carolina for many years. And sort of more leftist, progressive people who were more interested in
Hubert Humphrey.
Kind of. Well, Hubert Humphrey was caught in an interesting. If you want insight,
you're a splitter.
I'm a splitter. Yeah. Hubert
Humphrey
Humphrey was connected with the Farmer Democratic Labor Party in Minnesota, which was an old third party, which often aligned with the Democrats, but it was from the 1890s. Initially, was the Farmer Labor Party, but they have become over time. They were the mainstream of Minnesota politics, but wildly left wing compared to other Democrats. So
you out there know from George. Listen, he knows the history in and out politically of the country, and I've got to say that paid off because you got to give us the year. You became politically active yourself in a campaign.
Oh, in a number, number of campaigns. But anyway, so my parents and their friends are all involved in this 1948 campaign. And what in the 50s, what they were doing was, my mother was a writer. My father was a businessman, but they still are very active in things like working for a nuclear testing ban and civil rights and all this kind of stuff. But I got a job. In high school, actually, I participated in a campaign distributing leaflets against. So at the very least, we were Democrats. That was kind of the most centrist that my parents and myself were. And the longstanding congressman who had gone to my high school was a guy named Donald Rumsfeld. So I worked as a very young teenager, I worked in two campaigns attempting to oppose Donald Rumsfeld and what the Democratic Party would do.
You were the unknown known. Somebody would come out of the woodwork against him, but he didn't know.
He didn't care. This congressional district, at least when I was a teenager, had never voted for anyone except a Republican in its existence, basically.
Tough going.
Yeah, and they would find occasionally usually a fairly wealthy Democrat of some sort who was willing to be a sacrificial lamb. And this a story which is repeated in one side or the other more and more across the country. So I worked for him and stuff. And in 1966, I had a summer job, my father had died just before I started college, and he had a friend. He had connections with the janitors union. He had connections with a lot of union people, the janitors union in Chicago. And because of that, I had the possibility, which I almost took, or was in the process of taking, of being a janitor at the Marina City. I don't know, we were talking about Bob Newhart very briefly earlier, but if you saw the old Bob Newhart show, it starts where he's walking along the Chicago River and looking up at these two strange circular buildings, very tall, skyscrapers, but they're cylinders that go up, and they were called Marina City. And so I was interviewed successfully. They didn't turn me down to be a janitor.
They asked you to spell your name, and you got a 70.
That's right. And I was going to be issued a bucket and a mop. And I was feeling worse and worse about the possibility of this. And as I was walking back from my interview with the the head janitor of Marina City, I passed by a storefront which said Paul Douglas for Senate. And Paul Douglas was the current United States Senator from Illinois, a diehard Democratic liberal, really a magnificent kind of guy. He'd been an economics professor at the University of Chicago until World War II, when at the age of 50 and with a waiver for both for age and eyesight, he joined the Marines and fought at Guadalcanal.
Yes.
I was just
So this guy,
astounding guy, and he'd been
storefront.
yeah. Well, it said Douglas. It
and
said
you
Douglas.
went inside.
I went inside and I said, "Gee, is there something I can do?" And I said, I think I'm supposed to be a janitor, but I'm thinking of leaving it. And maybe if I worked for you for free for a couple of weeks or something, you could start paying me, which they did. I mean, I suggested that it worked, yeah, and then.
May I say, your resume was good at that time, better than for a janitor. George was a presidential scholar. He met, unlike me, or you, he met Lyndon Baines Johnson, President of the United States, who came up to you and pinned you.
Well, he handed me a medal.
Handed you the medal.
Yes.
I mean, tell us more about that. A little interlude before you get into your.
Okay. Well, briefly, this is a program which still exists, actually, called Presidential Scholars. It's morphed over time. It's something you apply for.
This is the first wave.
This was the very first year, and at that time, you didn't apply for it at all. In fact, no one knew that it existed. I just, in the last month of high school, I just got a telegram, and someone knocked on the door and handed me a telegram.
Those days, you actually did get a telegram.
And saying, President, I would say Mrs. Johnson and I came from the White House and said, Mrs. Johnson, I want to invite you to Washington for a week, as you have been named in one of the first group of presidential scholars. And
I think there was one.
There was one boy and one girl
female
from each state.
Each state.
Yeah.
So 100. It was 100.
It was 100. There were an extra 15 or so who were. There was one really interesting guy who I met from my own state who was totally deaf, so they threw in. So there's I think like 117, but basically it was one boy, one girl from each state, and we went and we had hamburgers served to us at the White House and had there was a big concert.
Did the hamburger come on a silver plate?
Yes, that's what was. I always struck me that they had the meal. The meal was not too different than what Donald Trump will probably prepare for everyone. He admires because he likes McDonald's and all that.
After you got the hamburger. Yeah. You all stood in a line, or how did you do it?
Before the meal and reception were after the awards.
The
awards where Johnson gave a speech and presented us with our medals. And
called you up by name?
Medals were, this is Lyndon Johnson, we're the head of Lyndon Johnson on a medal designed by Jacques Lipschitz, who was a famous sculptor of the era. And
you still have
I still have the medal, yes. And but after that, there was this dinner, and there was a concert with the Kingston Trio and all sorts of strange. Jerry Mulligan played baritone saxophone. That was the two people who most impressed me in this group. I mean, theoretically, all these celebrities had been the group that chose the scholars, but I can't believe that was the case. But the two people I was most impressed at meeting were Jerry Mulligan and Stan Musial of the Cardinals.
May I say, now, with this medal in mind, and he's been awarded by the president, he's in initially unpaid.
Yeah,
position.
so back there. So then I went to work. I licked envelopes for Paul Douglas, and I went to Serbian picnics and all this stuff. And after a week or two, it was discovered that I was fairly articulate and could write. So I ended up writing press releases and stuff like this. And so I had this little group of friends from.
You were paid in the high double digits.
Yes. Well, actually, for that, I was paid in the middle double digits. I think I got $50 a week for that, which was something. It added up to,
Probably.
It added up
Yeah.
to $700 or $800 over the
yeah.
summer or something. And
Paul Douglas won?
no, Paul Douglas lost. He lost to, he had been a senator for 18 years or 3 terms, and he lost to Charles Percy, who was a guy directly from the area in which I lived, he owned a company called Bell and Howell.
And there was an event.
Yes, his daughter was murdered in the course of the campaign, which created a lot of sympathy for
votes.
it. Also, he was, by today's standard, he wouldn't be a liberal Republican by today's standards because the Republicans wouldn't let him in. But at the time, he was something of a liberal Republican. Douglas had, throughout the late 1950s, he basically wrote the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he and his staff, he was the great northern champion of civil rights with Humphrey. But
you had street creds as a political operative.
Yeah, and a couple of years, 2 years later, I came back to Chicago. I went into the Peace Corps early in the fall of 1968 after graduating in 1968. That I had spent the summer working in for a good government group in Illinois, kind of reviewing policy on different things. But I also got involved in George McGovern's campaign in 1968, which was really a holding operation for the delegates who had been committed and elected for Robert Kennedy. And some of the people from Paul Douglas's little coterie had asked me to be involved in that. So I ended up working at the convention, the horrible 1968 Democratic Convention.
Yeah.
And later, after I was in the Peace Corps,
How long were you? This is a 1 year thing?
2 years.
2 years.
It was in 2 years, and I came back.
In Africa?
Yes, in Kenya, in East
Kenya,
Africa,
yes.
and where I've written a lot of my fiction writing has centered on. But when I came back for a while, I was writing speeches for George McGovern in the 1972 in the primary season for 1972 and stuff. So
did you have
that was and the thing is, I was doing writing, and that was my first paid writing was actually all in doing press work and speech writing for politicians.
I'm sitting next to Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne's best-selling book ever was the biography of Franklin Pierce. The campaign of 1852.
Sold more copies than Pierce got votes.
More probably. No, it certainly wasn't the Scarlet Letter. It was the biography of Franklin Pierce. But anyway, in your political writing was what.
So that was and I've been active in the college newspaper at Harvard, the Harvard Crimson,
You're in Harvard, and you're also a place which generates paperwork.
Yeah.
You actually wrote for the Crimson.
Yeah.
And that was a time of controversies, struggles, riots, and everything else.
Yeah, and all that. But so there was that. But and Barbara, as an individual, was involved in those troubled times too. Barbara, she was in the class of 1970. I was in the class of 1968. The class of 1970. Basically, none of them attended their graduation because they were on strike. The entire college was on
insider's
strike.
tales here. I didn't
Yeah,
know.
and my class and era was very comparatively genteel to what started to happen
Yeah.
2 years later.
As some people say, there is before 1968 and then there is after 1968.
I mean,
just historically in the country.
Yeah, and it was a hugely decisive year, and the speaker for our graduating college class within the gigantic
Not going to
university.
say Strom Thurmond.
No, it was going to be Martin Luther King,
Oh, it had been intended.
and it ended up being his wife. And
Oh.
and what she basically did was give a little short speech about the Vietnam War, and
Yeah.
people came down and signed a petition.
Sure.
At the end, but we had a ceremony and things like that. Whereas by Barbara's class, they weren't showing up at ceremonies, and everyone was a little bit more militant and.
But enough
angry.
about
But that's
the world.
So-
This is Gloucester.
yeah.
Well, let me tell people, you got to go back a few years, but I think you'll remember, half the audience will remember, Freddie Kairos. What did you have to do with Freddie Kairos?
Well, Barbara, and I, after we met, we fell in love, and this was a longish process. We met and fell in love fairly quickly, but the process of ending up in Gloucester was longish. And in 1980, we both realized we were doing things, and she was being an editor, and I was being a writer, but there were things we could do almost wherever we wanted. I mean, in the modern, all these kids do everything from everywhere, but we moved to Gloucester because that was Barbara's home, and she wanted to be near her family, and there were some things going on in her family she wanted to be close to and stuff. So we moved here in 1980, and in 1981 we got married, and like many people we have met since, we were married by the legendary Freddie Kairos. It's at City Hall in a ceremony that lasted between 20 and 40 seconds in some fashion. And
Freddie got it down.
And it was nearly incomprehensible as well. He had
That was
yeah,
Freddie.
I do. And he was perfectly nice and wonderful, and
Wonderful man, but not an attentive, conforming bureaucrat.
And I
of any
keep
kind.
running into couples, and I say, well, we didn't have a religious ceremony. We just were at City Hall, and they said, "Oh yes, Freddie Kairos," and
Sure.
And it was always one person who knew very well who Freddie Kairos was, and their outsider partner who had ended up in Gloucester.
Well, a student in high school, they have a student government day, and people are either appointed or elected, I've forgotten which, and you become city councils for a day and so forth, of which I was one. And we met in the city clerk's office because nobody else was going to trouble themselves with
Right.
these people from the high school, except Freddie, who was just a wonderful person and very humble and nice. And as we were meeting, this wasn't planned or rehearsed, right? We were meeting to decide who among us would be the mayor. The city council at that time.
Oh, right, yeah,
picked
like
who
when
was the mayor.
Mac Bell
And we
became mayor for a while.
everybody, mayor for a day, mayor for a few hours. Then it's Cinderella's coach, and it's midnight, and all is gone. But as we were meeting, he got a phone call, which he couldn't just say out later. He was speaking. He was speaking with Senator Kennedy. He was speaking with Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy.
Yeah.
And it was evident from the little conversation. It was a time of a primary or something was going on, and so he was wired into the political fabric of the state.
Huh.
But you'd never know it. Meeting him, he would never wear it on his sleeve. just happened to be something that we kids, or at least I picked up on, and said, "Gee, this guy's a Kennedy guy." He's part of that group. Anyhow, you're in Gloucester in 1980s, and I'm trying to think, what was Gloucester like in the 80s? Oddly enough, I had moved out. I was in Brookline for decades, and I wouldn't have known Gloucester, what was it like in the 80s and 90s and so on. Tell us. For you.
For me, well, it was a kind of odd place. You know, I mean, I found it both charming and disturbing. I mean, I actually wrote a short story at one point, which is kind of set in the world of that.
Tell them the title, and it is we recommend books that are free, available at the Sawyer Library. The title.
Oh, this is a collection of short stories called The Immanence of God in the Tropics, and that's IMMANENCE, which is the quality of the indwelling presence of God in the world. It's like the Holy Spirit in the Trinity.
And notwithstanding its title, there is a story.
There is a story called On the Flats, which is very straightforward, which is set in a New England coastal town, and Gloucester is it. But the sense I had of Gloucester, I mean, when I met Gloucester people, they were and still are just incredibly in love with where they live and grew up and
true,
and came from, and they're very
There's some people
proud
who
of
don't
it.
even cross the bridge.
Yeah,
Yes.
one go over the cut, and there dwell monsters. Who knows what's on the other side of that? But I met Barbara's family and her friends and stuff like that, and there were a lot of very dark stories about murders in the woods, and I met victims of murders, before they were there, and
this is not fiction. It was real.
Yeah,
life
this is
tragedies.
they're kind of and I mean, it was wonderful to think of Gloucester as being for hundreds of years kind of the smuggling capital of the Massachusetts coast, because there are all these little places you can pull your boats into too, and that was wonderful. But it was also at that time it was a drug capital of the Massachusetts coast and of eastern Massachusetts.
Realistically, that's one of the few things I was able to keep tabs on because it made headlines and in your TV news. That a fishing captain made a wonderful cover. I mean, naturally, right? A fishing boat, it comes into port and unloads. What better cover than that?
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And there was also the IRA gun running thing, which
another aspect of it.
That came in, but there was.
None of that's in your short story, right?
Not about the drugs and stuff.
No.
What I was talking about, the tolerance for eccentrics.
Yes.
Which was on one hand, again, is charming. It's like the British sense of, there were interesting, crazy people. But there were also, people who were murderous or were suicidal or were causing harm to people. And I kind of couldn't meet, I couldn't meet a family or a group of families without some touches of darkness. And there was also because, it was an economically poor place. It was,
certainly
a dying fishing. It's been successfully a dying fishing town for a very long time, which speaks to the strength of the people who are in there. But it's
made us a working class community without work.
Exactly. And
we had to refine our identity.
And
by the time the century eked out
you
to
know,
an end.
so there were a lot of strands of stuff.
But you met artists at the time.
Oh,
and
sure, and there were,
people who, what was it, visual arts or theater or what people?
Oh, well, basically the relatives of people, I got to know the fellow bookie, Susie Natty, and I got to mention her mother, the eminent writer Lee Kingman Natty, and her
in your
Susie's
story,
uncle Walker Hancock, the
sculptor.
The sculptor, yeah.
In your story, don't people go to a sauna?
People go to a that's another story, but yeah.
Story, they go to a sauna.
So, yeah.
So you engaged with the Finns. The Finns.
Yeah.
Another thing, isn't that the clique within the clique? Gloucester or Cape Ann, and then there's the Finns, even smaller circle, and you eat nisu for breakfast and all that stuff. When we're talking your Gloucester days, I wonder what leaps out at you for. For instance, Barbara wrote about Charles Olson. But was it her senior thesis? Or?
Yeah, her senior thesis was about Charles Olson's letters to the Gloucester Daily Times, which were these wonderful.
One of them was a scream.
They were sometimes a little, to my mind, a little unintelligible and stuff. But it was during an era when there was a great deal of recreating downtown Gloucester, of tearing down and hopefully rebuilding and stuff, and sometimes just leaving bare and stuff. And he was, in addition to being a nationally famous, if not world famous poet and stuff, he was also deeply concerned with the city and knowledgeable about municipal affairs and stuff like this, and was, I believe, calling primarily for trying to preserve elements of Gloucester's history and physical building.
Publish that or didn't? Well, in the way that theses are published, I suppose.
You're right. Yeah, there wasn't anything special, but she was, when Henry Farini made a documentary about Charles Olson, it's about 25, 30 years ago now, maybe even longer ago. He interviewed Barbara as an Olson scholar.
Recipient witness and an Olson scholar. That's good.
And, and that's because she had met him on a number of, the big, she knew Charles Olson because she spent a lot of time with Kathy Bayliss, and Kathy Bayliss' father, Jonathan Bayliss, who was a writer and businessman. And he spent time with Vincent Farini and Charles Olson, and they were drinking and talking in the house downstairs while Barbara and Kathy were talking upstairs and stuff. But Barbara at one point went to London for a summer job in college, and saw that Charles Olson was giving a reading, and so she showed up at Charles Olson's reading, and he recognized her, and he said, "Hey, do you want to go to a party?" And so I met Lyndon Johnson, but who cares about Lyndon Johnson? Charles Olson took Barbara to this party with Mick Jagger and Allen Ginsberg and Marianne Faithfull.
Bingo.
So that was Barbara's encounter with world celebrities.
All at once.
Courtesy of Charles Olson.
All at once, like the slot machine where the bar. That's great. I like that. Anyhow, when you have looked back to your writings, and I love the idea that we're speaking on Gloucester Bookies with a writer. Look back on your writings that you've been inspired to put on paper. Is there any common denominator? What usually stimulates or makes you go to the pen to write something? Do you write in handwriting, or do you do that?
I have almost always typed. You used to type on a typewriter, if you've heard of such a thing.
Those are the days.
Those are the days. And when I lived in Africa for 2 years, I was there. We had no electricity at any time, so we were talking a real typewriter, which you got to use human force and get a little exercise out of it. But I used to make notes by hand all the time, which I don't do anymore. I may be getting too old or something, but I would scribble things down on scraps of paper.
Seriously, were these like lines for the story, or just an outline, or a plot, or a character?
They were descriptions of sometimes something I had seen, or just a person who occurred to me. I mean, something that would be
a name, a description of a face, a characteristic,
a situation, almost like a sentence long.
And would these ever...
I mean, like I have a story which is not in my collection, The Imminence of God in the Tropics, available at your local Sawyer Free Library. But the first sentence of
which... also can be bought, right, on Amazon or something?
Oh, sure, yeah. It's still for still for sale. It's
okay.
But there was a story published in a small magazine, and in fact, I may be giving a reading of this story in the spring, I hope.
Hey, let's hope.
The first sentence of which is, my orthodontist committed suicide when I was 10 years old.
That's compelling.
See, and
that draws
and then
you
it goes from there. And
right.
It's not that I would know if I jotted something like that down, that I would know a whole story.
No,
but
that's
the kind of and that's the first sentence
that came
of the story.
Yeah. And you say, what type of person would
deal
with that in a
and
worthy?
That's kind of
way.
So there's a story that
I
somehow that would turn into a story that I wanted to tell, and at that point I would then type. After it, and what I've not been a prolific fiction writer. I've read a lot of it, and I was doing other kinds of freelance writing during this, as working as a journalist. I did a lot of writing for the Globe, and
I read articles you wrote for the Boston Globe, and I recall your...
Well, the most famous locally is about the dogs of Lanesville.
Say that. Tell that one.
Okay, that was actually my first op-ed for the Boston Globe, was about all the different dogs in Lanesville, because I had been impressed. And then also there were various types of them. I mean, there were particular dogs who I remembered, and one who would kind of sit in the middle of Washington Street in downtown Lanesville and stuff. And there was a whole strain of a lot of black dogs, which Robert Natty informed me early on were all the descendants of a single, at least as he told it, and he'd grown up in Lanesville, so I was to believe him, of Grunblatt's dog, I believe. And I know nothing about Grunblatt except for the fact that he had this...
black dog.
He had this black dog, and at least as well as Robert told it, there would be all these handsome male dogs who would kind of, at the right season of year, would be snapping at each other furiously and, butting their antlers together in massive fights to see, who would approach the female dogs in heat. And while these big, beautiful males were strutting their stuff, Grunblatt's little black dog was running off, and he became the father of the next generation of all the dogs of Lanesville. So there was a moral to the story in some form.
I like that.
So
and you wrote this up for the...
I wrote that up for the Globe because
Yeah.
I'm not sure there was much point beyond it, the fact that I really liked the dogs of Lanesville. Later on, the kinds of things I would write would start with a little story like that of some sort, but would kind of draw some greater political or social point from it. But that was basically
a standalone.
I love the dogs of Lanesville, and it got huge response for and I'll bet people writing in all with their stories of the dogs of Lanesville, because that was an important part of Lanesville.
You remind me, and it's a quite serious thing, that a tip to the people out there who are writing something, write about dogs, because that's the moral of this story. And I heard personally, Jimmy Breslin, the New York journalist, came to Boston and addressed a group of about 100 of us, which was including me. And he told us, either somebody asked the question or he brought it up, what was the column that drew the most mail, letters and things. It was a story of a dog. And it was somebody had been mean, cruel, teased or something, a dog. And the way Jimmy wrote it up, it was like you'd be on that dog's side and really get right about for the pro-dog lobby. And that was enough to trigger, like the mailman walking in with a big sack of mail, and it's all for Jimmy Breslin. And he said that was the one that got more than he wrote one on John F. Kennedy, he wrote one on different other ones that are memorable in my mind and others, but that one got the most mail. So write about dogs, write about dogs. And
you got to keep, all writing is local, all politics is local, or you got to get it. I have a friend from this group of people I met at the Douglas for Senate office, a woman a little older than me, and she became for a while the editorial director of CBS station in Chicago.
Okay.
The editorial director, they don't do this anymore, but back in the day when you had to get your FCC license renewed all the time, there would occasionally be, on all local news stations, there would be a man or woman who would appear like once a week or something for a minute and kind of give an editorial.
Public service.
Yes, and it was very hard to come what it is that you say in this. I mean, they'd say, we're for charity. You should donate money to local charities or something. And no one paid any attention to this thing.
Except the FCC.
But it was required that you have like a couple of editorial. But what my friend came up with, and which got gigantic response, much more, I think it was the only thing that ever got a response, was making a right turn after red, being permitted to do this. This should be something. You should be able to turn right after a stop at a red light. And
this is before the law.
This is before the law. It was proposing this as being a law. It was at the point where if you made a right turn on a red light, you were breaking the law, and you could get a ticket for it. So, the city of 4 million people, as one, spoke up and wrote in saying, boy, this is a dynamite idea. And this was just occurring to me because today, this morning, I was reading in the newspaper, maybe it was yesterday, because there was an article about pedestrian and cyclist safety in Cambridge, which has had people being run over, walkers and bikers.
Yes.
Where I realized last year, apparently, they stopped having right turn on red. They made it illegal because people were being killed by panel trucks making a right turn. You couldn't make a right.
No.
Given bike lanes, which are sort of artificial anyway, unless you have a physical space which can't be crossed, you're going to go right across the cyclist lane, and that's how at least 2 of these people have been killed. So right turn on red is even though it seems like a no-brainer, and no one cared about bicyclists in 1968 or what,
different world.
When this was. But
and George is a bicyclist.
That's why
he will tell you.
I'm self-interested.
Ride a bike
in
is
this.
good. It's good. Sauna, I want to bring up before we conclude. I don't know if you had saunas before Gloucester, or is this a new experience for you? Saunas.
Well,
other than the heat and the humidity of Africa, but an actual sauna.
I had never. I had heard of them, and I may have encountered one or two in like a YMCA, but they weren't
Not
real
like that.
sauna. I mean, and
There's
the whole sauna versus sauna. I mean, the pronunciation thing going. So I came to Gloucester, learned how to pronounce the word, and learned there really should be wood have a wood stove and all this. I mean, even in Finland, actually, there are a lot of electric.
These days, I know what you're saying.
They've moved on, but encountering this whole Finnish world.
Ever make it to the top?
The top shelf? Oh, I could. Yeah, but it took a while.
This is the heated people. Sauna, it's okay. You go down to the lowest bench, but that's for the kids usually. The top bench is like the hot heat rises, right? And all steam, and you'd be like in the clouds rather than down below.
Well, the way you started off, if you were a year old or 10 months old, because the heat could be really devastating to a tiny baby or a kid. Start off in a bucket. They bring in a bucket, and there'll be a little kid.
That one I didn't remember.
It'd be a little kid in a bucket, and they keep pouring cold water over the kid at the same time as if they were pouring hot water on the stones on the stone to make more steam.
Yeah. Well, that's delightful. If we have a minute, you want to say anything profound to end and conclude, or a little witticism, or what? I'd tell one. In your article to the Globe, one of the articles, you mentioned Barbara gave you advice, and that was stuck with me. She said, always buy two, something that you like, 2 pairs of shoes, whatever, because by the time you want the second one, they won't be making them anymore.
Sure.
That was her advice that you quoted.
Yes, and I have sometimes followed it, and I've wished that I have followed it more. But only again in recent days, I misplaced a pair of fleece gloves. I have started in the past week or two on the coldest nights to wear gloves again, and I'm losing things right and left. My wife only died 11 months ago, and so I'm very concerned about losing things and misplacing things. But I misplaced this pair of fleece gloves, which I found, eventually. But before I started to look up to see if they could be replaced, and no, because they had really good grippy leather palms on them, and they don't make them.
Ladies and gentlemen,
so always buy 2.
Always buy 2.
Or if they're shoes, buy 4.
4. This is like, unless you're one-legged. Anyway, this is a wonderful. We've concluded. We'll see you next time. Good luck. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Tuolla Lontoossa Jennin mä kohtasin. Halo Vepi, oho. Hän on neidosten joukossa kaunihin. Halo Vepi, oho. Suukon kirsikka silmät niin mustat kuin yö. Ja ne loisti kuin tuikkiva tähtien vyö.